do 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 do. All right, everybody. Hopefully you enjoyed my beatboxed intro. Of course, I did not get the real intro set up today as my producer abandoned me for some kind of actual event that is not my weekly chess class. But I hope you are all here joining me anyways for this edition of the Endgame class. Of course, this is the class where we look at endgames. I know you wouldn't expect it from the title, but that is what we do here. Last week, I did a 1-hour lecture on corresponding squares, and I bet you thought we were done, didn't you? I bet you thought you could escape. There's no escaping, though. No escaping the corresponding squares. I highly recommend you guys check out that lecture first. Before watching this lecture, I am going to do a 5 to 10 minute recap over everything we've gone over so far, but it is some very complex ideas. And if you have absolutely no primer on what corresponding squares are or what we're doing with them, then you might end up getting a little bit lost. But with all that in mind, what we talked about last week was how you can go about choosing your corresponding squares. The first time I ever taught a lecture on corresponding squares, I did not even know this method existed. I read about this method pretty recently in a book called Comprehensive Chess Endings by Averbach. I think the actual chapter on corresponding squares was written by Zarin, a very famous king and pawn endgame composer. And they suggested this method where you look at the key squares and you look at the shortest path between the key squares, and with that shortest path you sort of have all the information you need to create a system of corresponding squares. There are only so many systems of corresponding squares to choose from, and you can choose between them based on this shortest path and the shape thereof. So one of the studies that we talked about in a previous lecture was the one that you see on your screen here. So just as a recap, I wanted to go over this one again. I'm not going to ask you guys to solve it. I'm just going to sort of review what it is and how we get there, and then we'll move on into some new territory today. Of course, in the first lecture, we talked about the 8-square triangle system. You use sort of a triangle of squares, and then you build out the squares around it to get 8 full corresponding squares. Then from those 8 squares, you can expand them as far as you need to solve the study. So first and foremost, our first job is to find the key squares in the position. So key square number 1, of course, is going to be the square d6. Of course, a key square is a square that if your king lands on it, then you win the game, right? So if the white king gets to d6, doesn't matter where the black king is, we're always going to be able to invade over here, take a pawn, take the e6 pawn, easily winning, right? Key square number 2, you might expect to be the square of f4, but it turns out from f4, if the black king is on h5, we're not actually going to be winning. We would have to retreat our king, right? So f4 is not quite good enough. However, g4 and g5 very much are. So we have this one key square over here on d6, and we also have these key squares over here of g5 and g4. Now, our next step, of course, is constructing the shortest path between the two. So what do we have here? Well, we have c5, d4, e3, and f4 for white, right? This is our shortest path between the two. Now for black, you can go e7 to defend the key square, f7, g6, and then finally h5 to defend the other key square of g4. I'm not going to really include g5. It, of course, is a key square, but for all intents and purposes, g4 is the closer square that white is threatening to come to. So these are our shortest paths for both sides, right? We have this path for black, e7, f7, g6, h5, and this path for white, c5, d4, e3, f4. And the idea that was introduced last lecture is how to use this shortest path to determine your system of corresponding squares. And of course, in that lecture, I recommended the first thing you look for is the possibility to construct the 8-square system, which is possible here. How do you know if you have an 8-square system? Well, if you have 2 squares diagonally adjacent, like this, 1 linking square in between, and these 5 squares around the outside round the outside, all available to you. And same goes for black here. The linking square and the squares round the outside, as they say, right? So you construct this system of corresponding squares. We're going to get rid of these other two squares on the shortest path for now, just for clarity's sake. And what do I mean by this is our system of corresponding squares? Well, these squares all correspond 1 to 1. None of them, no one square in this 8-square system corresponds to 2 squares in the matching 8 squares. They're all 1 to 1. So this square corresponds to F7, this one to G6, this one to H6, F8, G7, so on, so forth, etc., right? So you have this corresponding squares system set up. Once again, 8 squares for white, 8 squares for black, all from the shape of the shortest path. And then because it is a system, it can be extended. How does it extend? Well, the squares sort of leapfrog over each other. This one also corresponds to B4. So if a king is on B4, black has to step to the corresponding square that corresponds to D4. So of course, for black, that would be F7. So B4, D4, and F7 are all linked. Same goes for B3. It leapfrogs from D3 to B3. D2 leapfrogs from D2 to B2. It also goes in this direction, so D3 and D1, C3 and C1, and in fact, B1 and D3 and D1 are all the same. We can even use the A file as well to go from C2 to A2, right? Now I'm going to get rid of these confusing arrows. Once again, this was covered in last lecture, so it's just a review here. So, what square should white step to in order to win this game? Well, let's think about it, right? Black is on the H8 square, which corresponds to the C2 square. So to win the game, we want to step to the square that black is already on, because black then cannot access that square. So of course, the winning idea here is King A2, stepping to the corresponding square of H8, which we built using our system of corresponding squares. So King A2 would win the game. After something like King G8, he is on the square that corresponds with C3 now, so we go to A3. King F8 now, and black is losing control over the corresponding square with D2. D2 corresponds with H7. Black cannot make it that far, so white is happy to go to B2 now. Then, for example, king back to G8 would be met with, let's see, what is that going to be met with? Let's build our little squares here. That would be met with king C3, right? The corresponding square. King C3, king G7, king D3. And now you see black finally has to decide between these two squares. If he goes to F7, we go to the corresponding square. And now black must decide which square on the shortest path to go to. If he goes this way, we go the other way and get to D6. If he goes this way, we go this way and get to G4, thereby winning the game. So this was the first system of corresponding squares that we looked at here. The 8-square system involving this triangle pattern that we see from the shortest path. 2 squares, 1 linking square, and the 5 squares on the outside for both sides. Now, obviously, this system requires a lot to be available, a lot of squares to be available for both sides to work out. So what do you do when there aren't that many squares available to both sides? Well, that's when you go to the second thing that we looked at, which is, of course, the quadratic system. And the quadratic system is actually far simpler than the 8-square system. So why include the 8-square system at all? Well, because you must use it whenever you can. The quadratic system does not work when the 8-square system is available. So you can only go to this other system if the 8-square system you've already tried to make work and failed because it just wasn't available. So then, going to the quadratic system, there are 2 ways to sort of think about it. Way number 1 here is very similar to the last system that we looked at. The shortest path is still the same. The only difference here is we've included these 2 pawns, which of course denies white access to this E2 square. And because white is denied that access, he cannot construct this 8 square system because E2 is unavailable. So what happens then? Well, we fall back to our quadratic system. Quadratic, of course, if you're familiar with any math terms, means a shape with 4 sides. In this case, it's going to be a square. So we can make our square using this same base little triangle here. But instead of making all 8 squares, we pick the side where we can make a 2 by 2 square, which is in this case, going to be like this, right? So we do the same thing for black. We have G7, and then this side corresponds with this side, so F8 and G8. Again, we did all this last time. And now C4 is going to correspond to F8, C3 to G8, D3 to G7, and D4 to F7, if I get all my squares right. So once again, this is our system. And just like in the previous case, this system can be extended with the same leapfrogging type of gesture. So D4 is going to be the same as B4, D3 as B3, D2 is going to be the same as D4, and so on and so forth. So what move is going to be winning here for white? Well, let's think about it. Black is on H7, which is sort of the same as F7. What corresponds to F7? Well, let's take a look here. It's going to be the square. Don't want to mess this up. Don't want to be embarrassed forever. Of course, F7 corresponds to D4, right? That's our square on the shortest path. So D4 extends out to B2, so King B2 wins the game. Now, no matter where black steps, he steps to G7, for example. We have these 4 squares and these 4 squares. G7 corresponds to D3, so King B3 makes sense. Now we have something like King F7, for example. F7 corresponds to D4, so King B4 should be played. King G8 now, for example, would correspond to D4 goes here, D3 goes there. G8 is the same as C3, so King C3 would now win the game for white. And just for example, King F8 means King C4. If you go here, we go here, I believe, to the corresponding square, and black has to give up on the shortest path, right? Same as last time. White is going to end up winning because of the corresponding squares. F7 is a better try, but we still step to the corresponding square. And now, just as in the previous case, black must choose a side on the shortest path, and white can go in the other direction. All right, that was our supposed to be 5 to 10 minute review. Maybe it took more like 15 minutes, but that's okay. So questions on this system that we went over last week before we move on to some new studies. Questions here. This is all on lichess.org, by the way. I should mention, I don't even know if I put that in the title. I did. Yeah, it is on lichess.org. So any questions here? I know I went through this pretty quickly. Is it like stepping into opposition? So yeah, the way that I would characterize it compared to opposition is the opposition is like a form of corresponding squares. Not so much the other way around. Corresponding squares is sort of the general idea, the base of theory, the systems that it's like the mechanics behind opposition. It's how it works. When is it safe to approach closer? So whenever you can approach closer, you should. When can you approach closer? Well, you can approach closer when black is unable to step to a corresponding square for you. So for example here, after King B3, King G8, it would not be safe to approach closer, I believe. Because, well, actually in this case it would. But after King B2, King G7, it would not be safe to approach closer to C3 because black could step to the corresponding G8. Compare this with King B3, King G8. Now black cannot step to G8 because he's already on G8, so King C3 would be a winning move. Okay. All right, well then let's move on to some new studies. Hopefully you guys have a good idea of what we're looking at here. I want to start off a little bit simple. So we have, in this case, sort of a simple version of one of the various systems that we looked at before. So what's step number one? Step number one is identifying the key squares. And you guys might recognize this system, this study from the first corresponding squares lecture I ever did. But here we're going to try and look at it from this new perspective of our shortest path system. So what are the key squares? I mean, yeah, key squares. That's what I'm asking about. I remember. So F4 is definitely a key square. And then C7 is a little deceptive. C7, in fact, is not going to be a key square for us. For one, King E7 would still be boxing our king out. But then you could argue that D8 would be a key square. In this case, due to Black's having counterplay, Black has counterplay here, D8 is not going to be a key square. Because if you start going all the way up to D8, Black's going to come this way and take all your pawns, and then you're going to lose the game. It's just too far away. So F4 is one key square, and there's actually sort of a hidden second square that Chess King has pointed out here. It's the E5 square. Now, how can E5 be a key square when it's defended by a pawn? Well, if you imagine that the Black King is sort of not defending the E5 square, then if the White King is attacking the E5 square, we have this option to play the move E5, and it turns out that this position is in fact just going to be winning. White can now go and collect on this pawn, or this pawn, sorry, not like that, or this pawn, no matter where the Black King is. So that makes E5 a key square, thanks to this extra option for White to push his pawn to E5. So we have our two key squares. Now, what is the shortest path between these two squares for each side? What is the shortest path between these two squares for each side? We have our key squares, so what is the shortest path for each side? So yeah, D4, E3 for white is absolutely correct. It's the shortest path between the two. And F6, G5 is also absolutely correct. So now, we have our shortest path. Based on this shortest path, what system of corresponding squares should we use? What system should we use? So yeah, learner's point, when I say shortest path, I don't mean anything based on the current king's position. I just mean the shortest path between the two squares. The shortest path where you can attack one of the key squares and then leave that square and go and attack the other one. So of course, it's the 8 square system. So let's build the 8 square system. I'm not going to use colors because colors are cheating. All right, we have our 8 square system. Now, what can we do to actually solve the study now that we've determined what system we have here? How can we actually solve the study now that we know what system we're dealing with? Yeah, you just extend the squares by skipping. And look at how easy this study actually is with this system. Look at how easy it is. You find the key squares, that's the hard part. You find the shortest path, you discover which system it is, because we just know, and then you extend it out. So you extend it out, and it turns out that Black is on the course on G6. Well, Black is on G8, which is essentially the same square as G6. And so we want to step to the same square. So we extend D3, which corresponds to G6, out to B3, out to B1, and we have our first move. Now King G7. What should be played here? Well, let's look at our corresponding squares. I'm not going to use any circles this time, because that's how confident I am. So we have this 8 square system versus this 8 square system. D4 corresponds to F6, so C3 should correspond to King G7, which means King C1 should be played, extending out C3 as such. And now, let's say black tries to rush towards the center to f6. We know f6 corresponds with d4, which extends to d2. So king d2. And now we can battle the black king back and win the game. Or if he steps to g6, trying to be a little bit more clever. Of course, g6 corresponds to d3 in our system. And now black once again has to choose between the two paths. King f6, we step to the same square. Now the king has to step away, and we can play e5 and win the game. And if king g5, we go king e3. Once again, the king steps away, and we win the game. All right, beautiful stuff. So easy. Took 3 minutes for us. It's just that easy. We need Sharpie markers. How are we supposed to just visualize this? Well, if you follow this system, I think it's actually not so unrealistic to actually visualize it, right? Like here, let me put my money where my mouth is, right? And try this against Stockfish here. Okay, are you guys ready for this? I wasn't planning to do this, but we'll try this out. I will play against Stockfish level 8 with the white pieces here, right? Can you guys actually see what's happening? You guys can actually see what's happening. That's wonderful. All right, so I know king b1 is the first move, I just remember. All right, he goes king h8. So where are our squares? These 8 squares against these 8 squares. So he's on the one that corresponds with h6. What's h6? Well, g5 and e3 correspond. h6 and d2 correspond. d2 jumps over to b2, so king b2, right? Now, Stockfish goes to h7. h7 is corresponding in our system. This is our 8 squares. These 8 squares corresponds to c2, so we step to c2. g7 now is c3. g6 is d3. And wouldn't you know it, he has to choose between the two. And I go e5 and win the game. I'm not going to play this one out because I don't want to waste your guys' time too much. But there you have it. It's just that easy, right? Just that easy. Pull this back up here. So you just build your system. All right, now, if you guys remember my first lecture on corresponding squares, I ended rather pessimistically by presenting this position and saying, good luck solving this one. There's just so many squares. I don't see how it could ever be done. But now, with our newfound knowledge of these systems, I think this position very easily can be solved. I should mention, by the way, that last study that we just looked at was composed by Locke all the way back in 1892. And this one is a famous study by Lasker, former world champion, and Reichhelm back in 1901. So step 1, identify the key squares. So Larry Goodman, in that particular study, I think that the squares did line up in that pattern, but they're not always going to line up in that pattern, which is why it's good to know this this system where we find this 8 square triangle if we can, and then build out from there, and then we can always rely on that to help us out. So you guys have it, right? b5 is a key square. If white gets to b5, he gets to take on a5 and win the game. Other key squares are g5 and h5. Beautiful stuff. What's the shortest path? I'm not going to waste your time with this question. Actually, no, I'm not going to waste your time with this question, right? The apparent one is c4, d3, e3, f3, g3, h4. In this case, though, it's very important to notice that white actually has a bit more leeway in this one. There's a bit more ambiguity, because he could also step to e2, and this path is just as short as stepping through e3, right? Similarly, he could also step to f2. So this is actually our shortest path, with both the e3 and the e2 squares, and the f3 and the f2 squares. And black's shortest path is similarly going to be b6, c7, these two squares, actually, those two squares? Yeah, I think those two squares, these two squares, and g6. And so this is our shortest path. Now, how can we go about building any system of corresponding squares from this path? What do you guys think? This path should be all we need to build our glorious system here. Should be all we need. So yeah, c6 would also be a square that white wins if he achieves it, but b5 is already an easier key square to get to, so c6 is sort of irrelevant to the study. Why not through b7? Well, we're saying that black needs to step to b6 to defend b5, right? He needs to be on b6 to defend b5 when white's on c4. This is the shortest path, right? This is the end of the path to defend b5. As far as why not a6, well, it's a longer path, right? It takes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 versus the 5 moves from b6. So yeah, Chess King says, this one looks like the quadratic. So which squares are you using from the shortest path to build your pattern, Chess King? Let's start with that. Which squares should you use from these options along the shortest path to build your system? All right, try one more time, Chess King. I don't think that's what you actually meant to type. C3, C2, D2? I don't believe that's quite right. If you meant C4, C3, and D3, then you would be correct. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt there. So the trick here is that you never want to use any of these ambiguous squares when trying to make your corresponding square system. The reason for that is when you have this ambiguity for both sides, there's a lot more options, right? Whenever white steps to e3 or e2, black can be on either of these squares, which means it's not going to be very restricting. It means black is going to have options, right? If black ever needs to pass, he actually can if he's on d7. He just goes to d8, and it's essentially the same. So you want to choose squares with the least ambiguity as possible, which means that c4 and d3 are the squares on the shortest path that you want to choose. Similarly, it'll be b6 and c7 for black. Now, can you make an 8-square system here? It turns out you cannot, because of course this square is defended, right? So you can't go round the outside as we would very much like to. I'm going to say that at least 8 more times. So we just need a linking square then in the middle, and we have to figure out where to build our quadratic system. Where do we build our 2x2 square now? So we have our linking square on these diagonally adjacent squares, and now how do we build our 2x2 square? How do we build our 2x2 square? Where does it go? So not quite, Chess King. When you build the 2x2 square out, as we saw in the second study in the review, you want to choose either side of the base triangle. You want to choose one of these sides, whichever side works for you. In this case, the left side does not work, right? The left side is defended by the pawn on a5. So we have to use the bottom side here of our base triangle. We can't use these squares that you were mentioning because it's not closely enough connected to our triangle. So yeah, Larry Goodman and Aryan all have, everybody has it now. These 4 squares, right? So what do we get? We get a 4-square system just as before. For black, it's going to be on c8. For d2, right? You see how this square corresponded with this square, and we're done with that for now because it's not actually a part of our quadratic system. And this square was corresponding with c7 because it's between c4 and the king side on the shortest path, just as c7 is between b6 and the king side on their shortest path. We have c3 corresponding to b7. d2 is behind d3, so it's c8 behind c7 for black. And c2 corresponding in this case to b8. Whoops, just punched the microphone. Hopefully that wasn't too bad for you guys. So now, how do we extend this out to actually solve the study? I'm going to get rid of these other confusing circles for you guys here. How do you color the circles red and blue? Lichess has some very nice shortcuts. If you hold down the Alt key and right-click, it turns blue. If you hold down the Shift key and right-click, it turns red, I believe. And if you hold down both Alt and Shift, it turns yellow. So, of course, the answer is, in fact, to play King B1 in the initial position to win the game. Why is that? Let me double check. It's King B1, right? Yeah, it's King B1. Why would I even doubt? Why is that? Well, because black is on the extension of C7, and so white needs to step to the extension of D3, which is, of course, King B1. And just for kicks, we're going to do it against Stockfish again, just to prove that the system actually works here. Here we go. Real time. Oops, I ruined everything. I ruined everything. It's all over. It's all over. Bad ideas. Bad ideas all around. Perhaps it's a sign. I like showing off, though, so we'll do it. We'll do it anyways. Let's see if I can beat Stockfish here. King B1 first move. Everybody agrees, right? Okay, it chose to step to B7. We have these 4 squares and those 4 squares, right? So what does King B7 correspond to for us? Well, King B7 corresponded to King C3, right? It was the linking square between these 2 squares that formed our base triangle. So I should, of course, step to C1, the extension of C3. Now he steps to C7, which is, of course, the extension of D3. So I will step to D1. Okay, now he steps to D7, which is, of course, the extension of the B7 square, which should be... Hold on, my brain is frying here. I think I messed it up already. Let's back up. Okay, let's slow down here. We have these 4 squares for us, and these 4 squares for black, correct? So D3 is C7, C3 is B7, right? Everybody agrees. So it is King C1. Okay, now he steps to C7, which is D3, so King D1. Okay, this was all right. All right, now we have this set up here. So this is B7, and B7 is... All right, I'm too confused. I'm sorry. We got to go back to the study. We got to figure this out. Here. King B1, King B7, right? Everybody agrees. King C1, King C7, King D1, King D7. Ah, so of course it's King C2 here. Everybody knows it's King C2. Why is it King C2? Because black no longer has access to the B8 square. This is where I got a little bit confused, okay? And why isn't King D8 good enough? Because we are in the main 4 squares for us, right? So even though this is sort of an extension of B8, it's also farther along on the shortest path than B8 actually is, right? It's too far to the right, because now after King D8, King C3, black is not going to be in time to stop us with King C7. Right? We just go King D3 now, stepping to the corresponding square, and black will have to choose along the shortest path. So, like, I'm not going to lie to you guys. Of course, it's still complicated, as you saw. Even I, who prepared the lecture and looked at all these things beforehand, could mess it up. So the point was, the tricky part I got confused on there, trying to demonstrate it, was in fact that after King D7, we can step into the main zone of our corresponding squares, because D8 does not actually work for black as an extension of B8, because we are closer to the shortest path on the queen side here. Okay, does everybody understand that? Does everybody understand that? I can do it against Stockfish now if you guys really want me to, but hopefully that clears up that confusion that I myself ran into. The pattern does work. The pattern does work. It works, I promise. Is that a rule just for the quadratic, or does that apply to the 8 square rule as well? So that's where the distance to the shortest path is actually going to be relevant. Now, for white, it's not relevant in this case. The reason for that, and it wasn't going to be relevant for white in the other cases as well, because black was never actually threatening to invade, right? White is covering all 3 of the entry points here. Now, if this pawn on d4 wasn't here, king b1 actually wouldn't be winning, because black has this chance for counterplay. So if black doesn't have this chance for counterplay, then you can sort of just extend out this pattern for white, right? But if black does get counterplay, then the extensions start to not work. And so while it doesn't seem like counterplay in this case for king b1, for this, while this doesn't seem like counterplay, it is in fact the same idea, right? White is just threatening to invade, and so because of that, black has to be in the same main 4 squares as white. If he steps back into these guys, of course, we step to the corresponding square. King c8 corresponds to d2, so of course we would just step to d2. Then he can either match us over here when we go king c3, when of course king b7, the corresponding square, is unavailable. Then here we step back, and it's the same idea. All right, let's move on to one more study. Show us Stockfish. All right, I'll do it really quickly. Really quickly. Don't want to waste too much time here. All right, give me white. Here we go. King b1. It's going to play the same moves, so it's going to be rather anticlimactic. King d7, king c2 now, because it can't step to b8. Okay, king c7 is the same as king d3, so I'll step here. King b7 now is abandoning the king side, so I step this way and come take all his pawns. Right? He's too far away from the key squares now. And I win. All right, everybody agrees. Everybody agrees. All right, let's move on to the next study. This one is by, oops, a little bit of a spoiler there. This one is by Halberstadt in 1930. And once again, let's try and identify the stuff that we already know here, right? Let's get a little bit more practice with these 2 systems that we're aware of. And then after this, I want to introduce to you a third one that you guys might actually be a little bit more familiar with. Make a 3x3 box for the system. You make a 2x2 box and then extend it. You can do the big extendo. So key squares for white in this case. Ariane says, quadratic, obviously. All right, we'll get to it. So h6 is going to be a key square, and in fact, g6 is going to be a key square as well, right? The threat of pawn to g6 is going to be good enough to win. And now c4 is not actually going to be a key square, because king a5 would be able to block you there. But it does turn out that b4 is enough for a key square. It's not immediately obvious why, but let me just explain it by showing you over the board. If white does end up being able to take on b4, black cannot keep the king boxed out of a5. And after the king gets to a5, white is able to break through. And after this, d5, as soon as this pawn leaves the c6 square, is the winning idea for white. Now, how can you come by this conclusion? Well, you just have to sort of calculate that bit out using chess skill. Like, that's not the job of corresponding squares here. That's the chess work you have to put in before you start using corresponding squares. So if white gets to play king takes b4, he wins the game because he sees this idea of b5, d5, e6, g6. All right, everybody loves that incredible winning idea, I'm sure. So we have our two key squares, or our, two entry points, right? We have b4 and we have g6 and h6. King c4 isn't good enough because king a5 would still box this out. So what happens here then? What's our shortest path? Well, we have c4 for white, d3, e2, f1, g2, h3, h4, h5, right? This is our shortest path. What's black's shortest path? Well, a5, a6, b7, c8, these two squares, f8, and g7, right? And you see how we meet at opposite sides of the board. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Equal lengths, as always. So now, based on this, what system of squares should we use in this study? And how should we build it? So what's the first step to making it? Well, we need to choose two squares along this shortest path for both sides. You need to choose two squares. Does it need to be of equal length? Well, if white's path is shorter than black's, then obviously white can just travel along the path and he'll get to the other side before black can win the game. If black's is shorter than white's, I think sometimes that does occur, but I could not name a specific example for you. So Danilo says d3 and e2, and that's actually perfectly accurate. It does turn out in this case that there's actually two other squares that you can use. You can actually use e2 and f1 if you prefer. And the reason for that is because the main four squares that you end up with are actually identical. If you choose d3 and e2, of course you cannot construct an 8-square system because this is in the way, very important. But the four squares you come up with are these four. Now if you choose e2 and f1, of course you can't construct an 8-square system because the board is too small, but you can build the same four squares off of the other base of the triangle, right? So it doesn't really matter. You end up with these four squares either way. Similarly for black, d3 and e2 are a6 and b7, so he ends up with a7 as the linking square, and these four squares for black. So that's all I'm going to give you. That's all I'm going to give you. Okay? So now we have white to move and win. What do you think? White to move and win. How can you do it? How can it be done? We built our system of corresponding squares. You guys know how to extend it out. So the question is, how to make progress here? So we have three different answers. We have king c1, king c2, and king b1 all being suggested. That is tough. That is truly tough. All right, does E1 correspond with A8? Are we sure about that? And this is our shortest path, and this is our shortest path, right? That's your sort of reference point there. The shortest path. So yeah, I do think king b1 is going to be the most accurate in this case. The less good thing about this study compared to the other ones is that white is going to be winning no matter what you play, because you're always able to sort of dance around black in this case, because he only has this one square on c8. He doesn't have c7 available, which is sort of tough for him. But king b1, I do believe, is the most accurate, because you step to the corresponding square to a8, right? a8 is c8, a8 corresponds with d1, right? It's sort of the square that's on the back corner compared to the shortest path for both sides. That's how you can tell they correspond. So king b1 is the most accurate. Now, if black chooses king d8, of course, we would step to the corresponding square to b8. If he steps to b8 or b7, then the answer for us is rather simple, right? If he steps to b7, that corresponds with e2, so we step to c2. He steps to b8, we step to c1, right? We keep both of our options open here as white. Why is this always winning? Well, because white is always able to sort of dance around black with these king b2, king b1 options. So king b1 I think is the most accurate, and then like I said, if king b8, we step to the corresponding square on c1. Now, if he steps to a8, we go king d1. If he steps to a7, we go king d2. If he steps to b7, we go king c2, I believe, right? King c2, king b7. If he tries passing now, then again, he is stepping too far away from the shortest length here, so we are able to just come take this pawn. Because he's abandoned the shortest path. If he steps to a7, that's a slightly better try. But now what corresponds to a7? Of course, it's going to be this square on d2. And up we go. And we win the game through that technique that we saw a little bit earlier. So excellent job on that one. Now, I am going to run a little bit over time here. So Danilo, it does actually depend. In this case, even if like black's path was somehow magically shorter, he wouldn't be able to win because he would have to stick around to make sure the white king doesn't get over here, right? White would just be able to draw by leaving his king like right here. If white's path was shorter, then of course white would win. He just goes the other way, right? Okay, so any questions on this one before I move on to a final system that I want to introduce? And then I'm going to have some closing thoughts on these system of corresponding squares, because the three systems that I've shown you, or the two that I've shown you, and the third one I'm going to introduce are not actually all inclusive, but they are the basic building blocks. So you guys are asking this hypothetical question, like what if black has a shorter path? And to be honest with you, I cannot think of any specific examples where this happens in studies, so I do not have a confident answer for you. But, so yeah, I don't have a confident answer for you on if black's path is somehow shorter. But we'll take a look at some studies that might give you a little bit more clarity on it. This is basic, seems hard. So the study itself is pretty difficult, right? It's a pretty complex version of the basic quadratic corresponding square system. But what I'm saying is you can get more complicated systems than the quadratic and that 8-square system. So the last system that I want to introduce to you is what's known as the triangular system. So as with the quadratic system, you use it when you don't have enough space to construct the 8-square system. With the triangular system, once again, you use this one when you don't have enough space to construct a quadratic system. We are a little bit short on time, so I'm going to introduce to you our shortest path here already, all right? B6 is obviously a key square for white. And then we have this strange passed pawn on the 6th. And due to this passed pawn, we can construct the other end of our shortest path, right? So if king c5, of course black needs to play king c7 to prevent white from invading. But we can actually create another end of the shortest path thanks to this pawn on c6. So, as we know from king and pawn endgames, let me just do something here. If the black king is on c8 and our white king is on d6, we can play c7 and win the game. That's just how it works with the pawn on the 6th. So whenever the white king steps to d6, in order to draw, black must step to d8, right? Then after c7 check, he can go king c8, and we have nothing better than stalemate in this case. So we have here our shortest path for both sides. What happens now if we try to construct our 8-square system? Well, white has enough room, but quite obviously black does not. He ran out of board space. What happens if we try to construct our quadratic system? Well, we take the linking square here. It looks like black might have enough space on the left, but this pawn unfortunately takes away this square from black. So he doesn't have enough space. So what do we do when we don't have enough space to make either system? Well, we get a rather basic triangular system in effect here. And the way the triangular system works is you start with these 3 basic squares in your system. D5 corresponds to C8, it's the linking square, C5 to C7, and D6 to D8. And this looks like even more basic than the quadratic one. Rather than 4 main squares, we only have 3. So there's one with 8, one with 4, and now one with 3, in fact. So here, white looks like he's not winning at first glance, right? Because black is already on the corresponding square, and it's white to move. But this is where your triangulation comes into play that many of you may be familiar with. And triangulation actually usually occurs in these positions where you have this triangular setup of corresponding squares. So in this position, white is winning because you can extend out this d6 square back to d4, similarly to how we've seen it work in previous systems. But now the key difference here is that c4 is also going to be related to d6. Why is that? Well, because you're threatening to step to the same 2 squares from c4 as d4. So what we have here is what you might have remembered from the last lecture. I didn't include this in this lecture, but last lecture we took a brief look at the quadratic system with the ambiguous back 2 squares, which is what these are. These squares are ambiguous, meaning they're sort of acting as the same, whereas black only has b8 to kind of act as this backward square, right? So why does white win? Well, white wins because he can triangulate, using the fact that these squares are ambiguous, and black only has this 1 square to match. So we can step back to d4. Now, of course, let's build these 3 squares again. There. Black can choose to step to the corresponding square on d8 or the corresponding square on b8. Either one is the same. But after he chooses, white is not going to step up to one of these 2 squares when black could match him, but he'll step to the other green square. And now black has the unfortunate decision between stepping to red or blue, when in either case, white is going to be able to win by stepping to the same color. King c7, king c5, if king c8, king d5, and now white has successfully triangulated, and it is black to move in the initial position. Therefore, white is winning. So that's where this idea of triangulation sort of comes into play. It's when white has this excess corresponding square where he can pass time, whereas black cannot. So that is the 3rd type of system that I wanted to introduce. Now, as my wrapping up words, so king c4 also wins in the exact same way. You guys are absolutely right. You go king c4, king d4, because these 2 squares are ambiguous, right? They act as the same square. Either king c4 or king d4 both win the game in this case. These are the 3 main basic systems of corresponding squares that were introduced in Comprehensive Chess Endings, where I got most of this material from. Highly recommend that book. And these are the 3 main systems that make up the vast majority, almost all of the corresponding squares studies that you'll run into in positions involving corresponding squares. Now, of course, it does get more complex than one of these 3 systems. There are positions where the most common, more complicated case is you'll run into positions where with this shortest path, you'll get 2 of these systems that sort of are halfway interlinked. So if you get a halfway interlinked quadratic system, like you have a quadratic system here, and they're sharing this one middle file, you get a 6 square system, which is pretty intuitive. And you can get two 8 square systems actually connected to each other to make a 13 square system. But they're all combinations of those basic systems that we looked at. So these are the basic building blocks, and I think this is enough to solve, I'm going to say like 90% of corresponding squares studies that you're going to come across. If you do want to go that extra mile and learn the rest of them, I recommend getting that book by Averbach, and again, the chapter I believe is by Mikhail Zarin. But I think this is where I'm going to conclude my study of corresponding squares on this YouTube channel. We went pretty in-depth here. Like I said, those 3 basic patterns are what make up, I'm going to say 90%, 90+% of corresponding squares endgames, and the other ones tend to be combinations of those basic patterns kind of put together. You can, of course, also make things more complicated by giving both sides like an extra tempi. Then both sides have the option to transpose into other systems of corresponding squares. That's another way to make it more complicated. And then there are just a few really oddball studies that seemingly for no reason at all change the system of corresponding squares ever so slightly, with 2 squares being shifted over, 1 square being shifted over. But those are very, very few and far between. They're very much the exceptions to this rule, which holds almost entirely true all the time. So any final questions for me on corresponding squares before we wrap this one up and call it quits on our study? Any final questions? So J.K. Rowling asks, would this concept work with 8 square versus quadratic? If one side has the 8 square system available and the other side has the quadratic system available, you have to just choose the quadratic system. That goes back to one of these. Goes back to one of these. I think this one would accurately show it. So black has, no, this one wouldn't accurately show it. Not sure if I could show you an example here, but it would just default to the quadratic system. The 8 square system only works if both sides have all 8 squares available to them. Just trust me on that one, I guess. So yeah, that is the book, Peter Peterson, Comprehensive Chess Endings. This is, of course, the series. And then Volume 4 is the one on pawn endings, and there is that chapter on corresponding squares in there as well. Do all of the top chess players use these concepts? So there are a variety of ways that people have used, a variety of methods that people have used to find corresponding squares and positions. Dvoretsky has this system of, looking at mind squares, but that one is very much on a case-by-case basis, and you sort of have to examine the entire position to figure it out, which is why I really like this system laid out by Zarin in Averbach's book. Because it's more of a system, right? You take a look at a pattern, you recognize what's going on, and then you can build your system out from there. So the problem is, JK, you would have that extra space. You would have extra space to extend out your quadratic system. But it wouldn't really be an 8 square system. It would just be an extension of the quadratic system, right? Because your 8 squares would have nothing to correspond to. There's no corresponding square on the other side of the board. It would just be an extension of the quadratic system. All right, I am going to call it quits here. Thank you guys so much for sticking with me on these corresponding squares lectures. I know they are really heavy stuff, and they are sort of brain melters. But I have a lot of fun going over these. Hopefully you learned a lot about corresponding squares. Be sure to join us on Twitch now as I do the final class for the night, Analyze Your Games. That is it for YouTube. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and I want to thank you very much